Today's lecture is on progressive era.
Here we will cover social reform, political reform, and urban reforms, along with the contribution of a few political figures and their attempt to reform economic and political sphere of the country. Urban evangelical Protestant churches were key sources of progressive activism and ideology. In the wake of crushing depression of 1890s, the clergy and congregation of some city churches rethought the older Protestant view that poor people brought hunger, unemployment, and disease upon themselves. However, looking back over the Gilded Age, many urban clergies observed that a cycle of economic boom and burst had thrown up to 40% of Americans into severe distress in every decade since the Civil War. Some preached a social gospel arguing that poverty's causes could be traced to society's most basic institutional arrangements rather than to the victim's laziness or other moral failing. Although the social gospel never completely eclipsed the older strain of American Protestantism that blamed the poor for their own predicament, it heavily influenced a generation of middle-class churchgoers as well as prominent business and political leaders. The movement gained momentum as it was embraced by Protestant Americans who published influential magazines, dominated higher education, and ran major charities. The churches also worked with secular associations to produce social services for whole neighborhoods, mapping the ethnicities of poor areas building by building and using the maps to decide where to start recreational, educational, and welfare programs. Progressivism was also shaped by the larger wave of trade ideas and industry that tied together the United States and Europe. Whereas Americans had once associated poverty, crime, and social discord with Europe, the traumatic depressions of the Gilded Age made clear that the United States was not immune to these problems and that American cities faced many of the same challenges as those in Europe. Like Jane Addams, an early pioneer of social work, thousands of concerned middle-class Americans made their way to European cities and universities in the 1890s and 1900s to study their approach to social reform. In Britain, these investigators found social policies that together served as a safety net for society's most vulnerable and unlucky members. Elderly people who could no longer work were supported by the national old age pension system. When workers fell ill, they received medical care through a compulsory system of national health care. In mining and other highly dangerous industries, government boards had the authority to set wages at a minimum livable level. If workers lost their jobs, state-run employment agencies helped them find employment and in some cases tied them over with state-sponsored unemployment insurance. Reformers discovered similar practices in Germany, Australia, France, and New Zealand. The French government, they found, aimed to avoid strikes and protest by providing public medication for industrial conflicts. With the exception of Jane Addams, who actively sought to end racial segregation, most white progressives were little concerned with the plight of black Americans in either the South or northern cities. They were equally uninterested in the discrimination suffered by the Hispanics, the Chinese, and the Japanese in the western states. The task of ending racial discrimination fell to a new generation of black intellectuals and activists who strenuously criticized both white progressives in action and the accommodation of many older black leaders. Black Americans would make no progress, argued W.E.B. Du Bois, until they had full political and social rights. Du Bois, who had studied at first in Harvard University and then in University of Berlin, rejected the view that black people should concentrate on developing trade skills and fitting into a segregated society. Answering Du Bois's call, a handful of supporters gathered on the Canadian side of Niagara Falls in 1905, declaring that we do not hesitate to complain and to complain loudly and intensely. 5 years later, Du Bois's Niagara movement, along with several white progressives and benefactors, helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP. Progressives, often though not always, supported women's suffrage and an expanded social role for women. Without necessarily questioning 19th century beliefs about stark gender differences, progressive reformers looked for ways to widen women's role in the public sphere, to bridge the gap between men's and women's experiences of the family, and to make family life more attractive and fulfilling. Many supported giving women more control over sexual relations and family size and eliminating the sexual double standard that forced men and women of the same class to live by different sexual scopes. Progressive activists also pushed for greater opportunities for women outside the home. The suffragists renewed their push for women's voting rights. They claimed that by denying women the vote, the nation was depriving itself of the full benefits of women's acknowledged expertise in matters of welfare, family, health, and educational policy. In 1900, women could vote in only 4 lightly populated states in the West: Wyoming, Colorado, Idaho, and Utah. In 1909, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, in an effort to draw national attention to its cause, coordinated the first of a series of street rallies. The suffragists also called on the department stores they frequented to support the cause. Soon, retail shops were incorporating pro-suffrage colors and symbols in their window displays. By 1914, suffragists had won voting rights for women in California, Arizona, Kansas, and Oregon. However, some women remained frustrated with the snail pace of reform. Other women reformers made women's labor reform their primary goal. The National Consumers League of Women's Organization, founded in 1889, led the charge, coordinating consumer boycotts against stores and manufacturers that failed to pay their female employees a minimum wage or demanded that they work more than 12 hours a day. Although most progressive women supported women's political and labor rights, some considered themselves as bohemian. Now we will start urban reforms. By 1900, breakthroughs in germ science had firmly established the bacteriological origins of common and frequently fatal diseases such as tuberculosis. Sanitation reformers saw their mission as both practical and moral. Under pressure from progressive reformers, many cities also began to lay dense network of sewer lines. By 1909, rather than depositing their waste and dirty waters into night soil buckets or pouring it onto the street, households of dozens of cities were flushing the matter into sewers. In 1880, US cities provided only 598 miles of waterworks. By 1909, that improved significantly. To many progressives, what made cities and slums dirty was not simply mud, horse deposits, and stagnant water, but the allegedly moral habits of the residents. Alcohol was especially important target because it lay at the center of both commercial nightlife and machine politics. Prohibition movement started to ban the sale and consumption of alcohol, and it became a major progressive cause. Organizations such as Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League gained strength during the progressive era. Because saloons, beer gardens, and wine shops were important communal institutions for German, Italians, and many other immigrant groups, progressive campaigns touched off bitter culture clashes. Many immigrants saw the prohibition movement as an attack on their whole way of life. Anti-prostitution organizations such as Social Purity Alliance spent a great deal of time and money on exposing commercial sex rings and publicly shamed prostitutes' clients. New York City's Committee of 15, that was formed in 1900, investigated the extent of prostitution in that city and published its shocking findings. Another New York organization comprising settlement house workers and prohibition activists sent undercover agents to dance hall and entertainment venues to identify sex workers and lobbied for stricter enforcement of anti-prostitution laws. The progressive assault on the sex trade served the larger purpose of policing urban sexuality, especially among urban newcomers. Investigators routinely called attention to the high proportions of immigrants in the sex trade. In 1910, Congress authorized the deportation of immigrants who worked in any music or dance hall or other places of amusement or resort habitually frequented by prostitutes. The same year, that means in 1910, the Mann Act made it a federal crime for anyone to transport women across state lines for prostitution or for any other immoral purpose. Now, the vagueness of the last phrase empowered federal agents to prosecute all kinds of sexual behavior, including non-marital, teenage, and interracial intercourse. 2 years later, the world heavyweight boxing champion Jack Johnson, the Texas-born son of a former slave, was arrested under this law for traveling across state lines with a white woman. She was actually his future wife. When the charges were dropped, a different white woman accused him of the same crime. Rather than face the new charges, Johnson fled the country. Now let's move on to political reform. Weakening the power of political parties in state and federal politics was a major objective of many progressives, who believed that skilled, educated experts would be more likely to emerge and win office if the parties did not control the nomination process. Consequently, progressives supported primary elections that would allow voters to influence party nomination. Ballot initiatives and referenda by which voters propose or enact legislation, as well as recalls which allow voters to remove an office holder, were also innovated. Barring individuals whom they considered unsuitable for full citizenship from voting was another progressive initiative. By 1910, 9 northern states indirectly restricted voting among many naturalized immigrants by requiring them to read English. 7 southern states imposed literacy tests aimed primarily at black people and impoverished whites. By these means, hundreds of thousands of voters were deprived of the right to vote. Voter turnout in presidential elections, which had run at between 71% and 81% since the 1840s, continued its steady drop after 1896 to just 49% in 1920.
Now we will discuss the contribution of a few political figures and analyze how they initiated economic and political reform. President Theodore Roosevelt initiated several key progressive reforms while in the White House. Like most progressives, Roosevelt was simultaneously hostile to working class radicalism and critical of big businesses. During his first term, Roosevelt repeatedly used his presidency, which he called a bully pulpit, to preach against both class division and materialism. The popular Roosevelt nudged the Republican Party towards accepting a major expansion of the federal government's role in regulating the economy. At first, he focused on monopolies by authorizing the Justice Department to prosecute companies that violated the Shanmann's Antitrust Act, starting with J.P. Morgan's railroad conglomerate. Some progressives and most radicals called for the abolition of monopolies, but Roosevelt advocated merely for the regulation on the grounds that the tremendous efficiency such organizations made possible could be harnessed for the public good. The Supreme Court ruled in government's favor in 1904, and Roosevelt brought an unprecedented 44 antitrust lawsuits over the next 5 years. Although Roosevelt made much of his reputation as trust buster, he was careful to take on only cases involving unpopular corporations or those that had offended him. He did not seek a rigorous system of checks against the concentration of economic power. Elected to a second term in 1904, Roosevelt's antitrust rhetoric intensified. Now enjoying the support of progressive reformers and much of the general public, Roosevelt called for an expansion of the role of Interstate Commerce Commission. During Roosevelt's presidency, progressive voices within the party had been powerful enough to enact the program of government regulation that Roosevelt advocated. But under his handpicked successor, William Howard Taft, the party drifted back toward its earlier pro-business conservatism. For example, Taft raised tariffs, a move that benefited big businesses and alienated many progressives. Divided between progressives and conservatives, the Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives in 1910. But progressive Republicans formed an alliance with pro-labor Democrats, passing a series of reforms that benefited workers, including new regulations for mine and railroad safety and an 8-hour workday for federal employees. Meanwhile, at the state level, progressive lawmakers responded to the protest of the National Consumer League by limiting women's work hours to 10. The controversial laws met with opposition from employers, as well as from some women workers who objected that they did not need the protection of either concerned middle-class consumers or a paternalistic state. The Supreme Court decided in 1908 that states could protect women and children from excessive exploitation in factories and laundries by limiting work hours to 10 per day. A number of states subsequently enacted minimum wage laws for women and stricter child labor laws. The most significant progressive accomplishments of the Taft year, however, found their way into the Constitution, which had not been amended since Reconstruction. In a short time span, Congress proposed the 16th Amendment,
which authorized the federal government to impose a direct and graduated income tax, and the 17th Amendment, which mandated that senators be directly elected by popular vote. Together, these amendments would have an enormous impact on American politics and life. They also went to the core of the progressive economic and political agenda. A modest redistribution of wealth and a more direct participation in politics by individual voters.
Now we will move on to discuss Woodrow Wilson. With Wilson's election, a Southerner held the office of president for the first time since the Civil War. The son of a slaveholder, Wilson recalled hearing at the age of 3 that Abraham Lincoln had been elected and that war was coming. Overcoming dyslexia and teaching himself to read, he went on to complete a PhD in history and political science and to serve as a president of Princeton University before entering politics. Like many progressives, Wilson was committed to ending class conflict, containing radicalism, and purifying the sources of social disorder. But he was also a segregationist, who segregated government offices and demoted or fired black federal workers in the South. A skilled strategist, Wilson rode the wave of popular support for greater federal regulation of big business while not alienating the South's Democratic base, which had been critical of strong federal government since the days of slavery. Calling for a new freedom in America, he explained that freedom now meant something more than being left alone and that government must be positive, not merely negative. But he cautioned in a language that appealed to the Southern whites. He absolutely objected to any form of government that proposed to take care of people by a process of tutelage and supervision. Wilson built support for his reforms by holding weekly press conferences and delivering annual State of the Union addresses before Congress, a practice adopted by every subsequent president. In the progressive spirit, he consulted widely with experts before making policy decisions, and his ability to work with Congress resulted in legislation that advanced key parts of the progressive agenda. Wilson also lowered Taft's unpopular tariffs and backed legislation that punished businesses that combined to restrain trade and limited the court's ability to issue injunctions against striking unions. Wilson, however, was not as anti-business as many progressives would have liked. He wound down the Justice Department prosecution of trust and did little to prevent National Guardsmen from massacring the wives and children of striking coal miners in Ludlow, Colorado in 1914. Perhaps the most enduring of Wilson's policies was his overhaul of the nation's volatile banking system. Like a number of his reforms, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 satisfied many competing interests, including the Southern and Western farmers who had demanded greater federal control of money supply since the 1870s, and bankers who wanted a centralized banking system. By ensuring that banks could issue more money in times of falling prices and less money during inflationary periods, the new Federal Reserve Board established a way for the government to stabilize the currency and free up credit for small businesses and farmers.